Consider this your 2 weeks' notice, Sarah. The company is moving in a different direction, Marcus said, with that smug smile I'd grown to hate. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, straightening his custom-made suit jacket. Don't worry, though. All your clients will be in good hands with me. I've already spoken to the Andersons and the Rodriguezes about the transition. I sat across from his mahogany desk in the corner office he'd claimed 6 months ago, keeping my expression carefully neutral as he delivered the news I'd been expecting for weeks. The Manhattan skyline stretched out behind him, a view he'd bragged about earning through his aggressive management style. What my soon-to-be ex-boss didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment ever since I discovered his scheme during a late-night audit of client communications. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 34, I'd spent the last 8 years building the most successful client portfolio at Palmer Financial Advisors. While other advisors chased quick commissions and risky investments, I focused on long-term relationships and conservative growth strategies. My clients trusted me. From small business owners to retired executives, they knew I always put their interests first. My portfolio had grown from $50 million to over $800 million in assets under management, all through careful planning and genuine relationship building. That's exactly why Marcus, our newly appointed managing director, saw me as a threat. My steady, client-first approach didn't fit with his dynamic new vision for the firm. Of course, I replied calmly, watching him blink in surprise at my lack of reaction. I'll start preparing the transition documents right away. I assume you'll want detailed notes on each client's investment preferences and risk tolerance levels. His smile faltered slightly. Marcus had expected tears, pleading, maybe even anger. That's how the others had reacted when he'd pushed them out. 3 other senior advisors in the past 6 months, all replaced with his hand-picked team of aggressive young salespeople. What Marcus didn't know was that I already had all the documentation I needed. Every email, every transaction record, every client communication that proved he'd been systematically undermining me for months. The paper trail showed how he'd been taking credit for my investment strategies while secretly planning to absorb my client base into his own portfolio. But most importantly, I had evidence of something much worse: his deliberate violations of fiduciary duty. He'd made one crucial mistake. He assumed that because I was quiet and methodical, I was also naive. "Glad you're being reasonable about this," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I know change can be difficult, but my new vision for the company requires a different approach, more dynamic, more aggressive. The market's changing, Sarah. We need advisors who can keep up." I knew exactly what he meant. Since taking over 6 months ago, Marcus had been pushing increasingly aggressive investment strategies, focusing on high-commission products regardless of whether they were in the client's best interests. He'd brought in a team of younger advisors who cared more about sales targets than fiduciary duty. The morning sales meetings had turned into something resembling a wolf-pack gathering, with Marcus encouraging ever more aggressive tactics. "I understand completely," I said, standing up to leave. "I'll make sure everything is properly documented. Would you like me to include the records of all the unauthorized changes made to my clients' portfolios over the last 3 months?" For just a moment, his confident facade cracked. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, just being thorough," I smiled. "I'm sure you'll want a complete record of all account activities, including the modified risk assessments and altered investment recommendations. For compliance purposes, of course." Marcus's smile returned, but there was an edge to it now. "Always the detail person, aren't you, Sarah? That's what I've always liked about you. So organized, so thorough. But don't worry about all that. My team will handle the transitions." He had no idea how thorough I actually was. It started 3 months ago when I noticed strange patterns in my client communications. Emails were being delayed, meetings were getting rescheduled without my knowledge, and investment recommendations were being changed after I submitted them for approval. Small changes at first, a bond allocation adjusted here, a risk tolerance assessment modified there. But the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. At first, I thought it was just typical corporate bureaucracy. Then I received a call from Mrs. Rodriguez, one of my longest-standing clients. She was a retired pediatrician who'd entrusted me with her entire retirement portfolio after her husband passed away. "Sarah, dear, I'm a bit confused," she said. "Marcus tells me you're planning to retire soon and that I should transfer my portfolio to his management. But when we met last week, you didn't mention anything about retiring. He also suggested moving a significant portion of my portfolio into some new high-yield investment products." That's when I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. Mrs. Rodriguez was a conservative investor who prioritized capital preservation. The investments Marcus was suggesting were completely unsuitable for her risk profile. I started digging deeper, carefully documenting everything. I set up forwarding rules to keep copies of all my emails. I recorded every client meeting with their permission, citing compliance requirements. I kept detailed logs of every irregularity, every unauthorized change, every misunderstanding that Marcus created. The pattern became clear. Marcus was systematically targeting my largest clients, particularly those with conservative portfolios. He'd make subtle suggestions about my outdated investment approach, hint at my supposed retirement plans, then push them toward his preferred high-commission products. More importantly, I had evidence that Marcus was pushing unsuitable investments, high-risk products that generated big commissions but weren't appropriate for our conservative client base. He'd been counting on my reputation for trustworthiness to smooth over any concerns while he gradually moved clients into his preferred investment strategy. What he didn't count on was my own strategy. The signs had been there from the start, if anyone had been paying attention. The way Marcus had swept into the firm like a hurricane, all bold promises and aggressive targets. How quickly he'd started pushing out experienced advisors who questioned his methods. The sudden emphasis on sales volume over client satisfaction. Even Richard Palmer, the firm's founder, who'd stepped back to an advisory role 2 years ago, seemed dazzled by Marcus's charisma and promises of explosive growth. Richard had always appreciated my conservative approach to client management, but lately he'd been echoing Marcus's talk about modernizing our investment strategies. I spent weeks building my case, gathering evidence methodically. Every modified document, every altered recommendation, every misleading communication was carefully logged and backed up. I even documented the subtle pressure Marcus put on support staff to alter records and backdate changes. The morning after my termination meeting, I arrived at the office early. While Marcus was probably celebrating his victory, I was about to detonate the career equivalent of a nuclear bomb. But first, I had one more piece of evidence to collect. I pulled up the latest batch of portfolio modification requests that had come through the system. Just as I expected, Marcus had already started implementing changes to my clients' investment allocations, without their knowledge or consent. Each unauthorized change was like another nail in his professional coffin. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Meeting at 10 to discuss transition timeline. Bring all client files." I smiled as I typed my response. Of course. I'll bring everything. He had no idea what everything actually meant. Instead of heading to Marcus's 10 a.m. meeting, I walked straight into Richard Palmer's office. The founder of the firm was already at his desk, reviewing quarterly reports. He looked up, surprised to see me. These days, everyone went through Marcus first. "Sarah? What can I do for you?" Richard asked, his expression concerned. Despite stepping back from daily operations, he still kept regular hours at the firm that bore his name. "I think you should see this," I said, placing 3 thick folders on his desk. "It's about some concerning patterns I've noticed in our client accounts, specifically unauthorized modifications to investment strategies and risk assessments." For the next hour, I walked Richard through the evidence. The unauthorized portfolio changes, the misleading communications, the inappropriate investment recommendations. Most importantly, the clear pattern of fiduciary violations that could put the firm's licenses at risk. Richard's face darkened as he reviewed document after document. How long has this been going on? Since Marcus took over as managing director, I replied, pulling up emails on my laptop. Here's where it started. Subtle changes to client risk assessments, then gradual shifts toward high-commission products. This spreadsheet shows the pattern of modifications all implemented without proper client authorization. I played a recording from my last meeting with the Andersons, longtime clients with a $20 million portfolio. In it, Marcus could be clearly heard dismissing their concerns about risk while pushing them toward complex investment products they didn't understand. There's more, I continued, pulling out another folder. Statements from several key clients who are prepared to take their business elsewhere if their portfolios are transferred to Marcus's management. Together, they represent over $300 million in assets under management. Richard was silent for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across his desk. Why are you showing me this now? Because Marcus gave me my notice yesterday. He's planning to take over my client relationships directly. And I believe these clients deserve to know exactly what that means for their financial futures. I paused, letting that sink in. Also, the SEC would be very interested in these compliance violations. My phone buzzed repeatedly. Marcus, wondering why I wasn't at his meeting. I silenced it without looking. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Richard called an emergency board meeting. Compliance officers descended on Marcus's department. External auditors were brought in to review all recent portfolio changes. Marcus, of course, tried to spin it as a misunderstanding. He burst into the board meeting, his usual polished appearance slightly disheveled. "This is ridiculous," he protested. "I was just trying to modernize our approach. Sarah's being vindictive because she can't adapt to change. She's sabotaging the firm's growth." That's when I played my trump card, a series of recorded client meetings where Marcus explicitly misrepresented investment risks, followed by emails where he ordered support staff to alter my more conservative recommendations. "This isn't about adapting to change," I said calmly. "This is about protecting our clients' interests and following our fiduciary duty. Everything I've presented is documented, verified, and legally obtained with proper consent." The board's decision was unanimous. Marcus was terminated immediately, his licenses under review for potential violations. An internal investigation was launched into all his client interactions. But I wasn't finished yet. "There's one more thing," I told Richard after the board meeting. "I've accepted a position with Meridian Wealth Partners. Several of my clients have already indicated they'll be following me." Richard's face fell. He looked suddenly older, the weight of the situation evident in his expression. "Sarah, wait. We can fix this. The board is prepared to offer you Marcus's position." I shook my head. "This isn't about the position, Richard. This is about trust. The firm knew about Marcus's aggressive sales tactics for months and did nothing. My clients trust me to put their interests first. Always. That trust is non-negotiable." The exodus that followed was beyond even my expectations. Not only did my long-term clients follow me to Meridian, but several of Marcus's former clients reached out after learning the truth about his investment strategies. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first to transfer her account. "I knew something wasn't right when that Marcus fellow started pushing those risky investments," she said during our first meeting at Meridian. "But I trusted you to protect us, Sarah. You always keep such good records." Word spread quickly through the financial community. Marcus's reputation was ruined. No reputable firm would touch him after the compliance violations came to light. The last I heard, he was selling life insurance at a small agency in Nevada, his dreams of Wall Street glory shattered by his own greed. Palmer Financial struggled to recover from the scandal. They lost over $500 million in assets under management within 3 months. Their reputation for conservative, client-first wealth management, built over 3 decades, was severely damaged. 6 months later, I sat in my new corner office at Meridian, reviewing portfolio performance with the Andersons. The view wasn't quite as spectacular as Marcus's old office, but it was mine, earned through honest work and genuine client care. "We never doubted you for a moment," Mr. Anderson said, looking at their latest statement. "When Marcus started pushing those complex products, we knew something was off. But we also knew you'd look out for us." I smiled, thinking about the folders of evidence still stored securely in my files. Documentation is everything in this business, Mr. Anderson. You never know when you might need to prove your case. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard, another attempt to convince me to return to Palmer Financial. They'd lost more clients in the past month as word of Marcus's activities continued to spread. The firm's reputation would take years to rebuild if it ever fully recovered. I left the message unanswered and turned back to the Andersons' portfolio review. Success isn't about quick wins or aggressive sales tactics. It's about building trust, maintaining integrity, and always being prepared to protect what you've built. Marcus had thought my careful documentation was a sign of weakness, just another quiet, detail-oriented advisor who would be easy to push aside. He never understood that my attention to detail wasn't a weakness. It was my superpower. A year after leaving Palmer Financial, I received an email from one of my former colleagues. Marcus had tried to get hired at another major firm in Boston, but his compliance violations had followed him. During the interview, they'd asked about the incident at Palmer Financial. Apparently, my documentation had become a case study in their compliance training. I saved the email in my records, right next to the original evidence folder. Some people learn their lessons the hard way, but if Marcus taught me anything, it's that the quiet ones aren't always the weak ones. 3 years later, my team at Meridian manages over $2 billion in assets. Our client-first approach has attracted numerous high-net-worth investors who appreciate our conservative, well-documented strategies. Palmer Financial, meanwhile, was eventually sold to a larger firm. Their independence lost along with their reputation. Richard called me recently, his voice tired. "We should have listened to you about Marcus sooner," he admitted. "That's what happens when you chase growth at any cost. You forget what really matters in this business." Last week, I spoke at a financial advisors conference about the importance of maintaining proper records and upholding fiduciary duty. In the audience, I spotted a familiar face, Marcus, sitting in the back row, looking significantly less polished than in his managing director days. I made sure to thank him in my speech. After all, he taught me the most valuable lesson of my career. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about proving them wrong by doing things right. Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 80s, still meets with me quarterly to review her portfolio. "Your detailed documentation saved us all," she told me during our last meeting. "You protected not just our money, but our trust." I smiled, thinking about the folders of evidence still securely stored away. "The truth always comes out, Mrs. Rodriguez. You just have to make sure you can prove it when it does." That evening, as I reviewed new client portfolios, I thought about how differently things could have turned out if I hadn't been prepared. Marcus had underestimated me, seeing only what he wanted to see. A quiet, detail-oriented advisor who would be easy to push aside. He never realized that being underestimated was its own kind of advantage. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one making the most noise. It's the one keeping the receipts.